My own son and his wife tried to have me declared legally incompetent. They thought I was just a frail, confused old woman they could trick into signing away my entire life savings. For weeks, they put on a show of loving care, isolating me in my own home and lying to my oldest friends, all while finalizing their plan to steal everything I had. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated me. So I used their own arrogance to set a trap so perfect, their public humiliation was absolute, and I made sure they would never forget it. You know, I've always found Sunday brunch to be a certain kind of theater. And at my daughter-in-law Steph's house in Scarsdale, it was a full-blown Broadway production. The set was always perfect sunlight pouring through massive windows glinting off crystal glasses filled with mimosas, illuminating the kind of white marble kitchen island that probably had its own zip code. I sat at the head of their enormous oak table, 77 years old, and watched the lead actress. Steph was a whirlwind of practiced grace, her laughter just a little too loud, her smile stretched a little too tightly across her face. I managed a bank branch for 30 years. I know the look of someone trying to sell you on a story that doesn't add up, the look of someone projecting a confidence they simply don't have. Every time Steph's eyes darted towards my son Rob, I didn't see affection. I saw a frantic, cornered kind of fear. This whole performance had been escalating for about a month. It started subtly, this campaign of care. It was a slow, creeping siege disguised as love. Steph started insisting she'd grab the mail for me, telling me not to worry about the walk to the mailbox. Then my weekly bridge game was suddenly deemed too much stimulation for me. When my old friends called, they were met with Steph's polite, firm voice on the line, explaining that I was resting and that she would be happy to take a message. It was like they were building a wall around me, brick by polite, condescending brick. They were walling me up in my own home, and my own son was their willing, if weak, accomplice. Rob couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. His gaze was always fixed on his expensive shoes. The moment the drawbridge was pulled up behind me came on a Tuesday. It was delivered in a handsome leather-bound portfolio. Rob was the one who brought it into my study, mumbling something about estate planning updates. He said Dan Harper's office had sent them over just a few signatures to keep things tidy. Now Dan has been my lawyer for 40 years. Invoking his name was a shrewd move. Steph stood just behind Rob, her hand on his shoulder, her face a perfect mask of supportive sympathy. The documents looked official enough, pages of dense legalese. To be honest, at that moment, their cloying presence was so suffocating I would have signed anything just to get them out of my house. So I did. I didn't see the tiny clause buried on page 17, the one granting Stephanie durable power of attorney, effective immediately. That night, I saw the first real crack in their flawless facade. I was in my sunroom reading, and they must have thought I'd gone up to my bedroom for a nap. I heard Steph's voice from the hallway, a harsh, panicked whisper into her phone. She was trying to be quiet, but the desperation carried. She said they didn't understand that the transfer hadn't gone through, and they needed liquidity. Now. A note was due on the 1st, and if they defaulted, well, apparently someone had threatened to call everyone. Everyone. I heard a little choked sob. Then she said the words that froze my blood. She told the person on the phone that she'd gotten the signature that day, that it should clear in a few days, but they needed more time. Just a little more time. The call ended. I just sat there, the book, feeling like a block of lead in my lap. And in the silence of my house, all the pieces clicked into place with the cold, hard finality of a vault door swinging shut. This wasn't about my health. This was a heist. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. For 3 days, I let the silence in the house curdle. I was no longer a victim in waiting. I was a predator. I sat in my favorite armchair, playing the part of a serene, fragile old woman. My son Rob fussed over me, draping a throw blanket across my legs with a look of pained concern that I now knew was pure guilt. From the kitchen, I could hear Steph on the phone loudly telling a friend some boring story about a charity luncheon. It was all a performance meant for me to overhear to reassure me that everything was normal. My mind, however, was anything but serene. It was a cold, clear machine calculating variables and waiting for the precise moment to strike. When Steph finally hung up, I knew it was time. I cleared my throat, just a soft little sound, and made sure my voice was deliberately a little shaky. I looked at Rob and asked him about that nice young man, Mark, the one who helped with their investments. I mentioned that Steph had brought him up the other day, and that I thought it would be lovely to have him over for tea, because, as I said, it's just so important to have a good financial advisor. The effect was instantaneous. It was like I had pulled a pin on a grenade. Rob froze completely, and every drop of color drained from his face. From the kitchen, I heard the sharp clatter of a spoon hitting the marble floor. A moment later, Steph appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with a panic she couldn't hide. She asked who Mark was, her voice at least an octave higher than usual. Rob stammered that Mark was their advisor, but that he was very busy traveling. His eyes kept darting to Steph, looking for a lifeline. I gently pushed back, saying that wasn't what Steph had said. I reminded them that I'd heard her on the phone with him just the other day, talking about some kind of deadline. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated terror. You see, they were amateurs. They were so caught up in their desperation that they hadn't even bothered to rehearse their lies. Steph rushed to my side, insisting I must have misheard, that she was talking about Mark the caterer for a club dinner. The lie was so clumsy, so pathetic, it just hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. And right then, I had all the confirmation I needed. Their guilt was scrawled all over their panicked faces. The next morning, I waited until I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as Steph left for her yoga class. Then I made my move. I didn't use the phone in the kitchen or my cell. I went down to the basement and picked up the old landline, a dusty relic on a wall-mounted cradle that no one had called in at least a decade. I dialed the number of my oldest and dearest friend, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor is a woman who sat on 3 corporate boards and has a spine made of pure steel. When she answered, my voice was no longer shaky. It was firm and clear. I told her I needed her to call Dan Harper for me to set up a lunch at the Westchester Country Club on Friday. And I told her to make sure Dan brought his notepad because, as I put it, there had been a hostile takeover. After that call, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Their pretense of gentle care evaporated and was replaced with the grim vigilance of prison guards. Steph barely left my side, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. They watched my every move. And I realized then with a chilling certainty that I wasn't just fighting for my money. I was fighting for the very air I breathed. Their desperation had made them dangerous. To win a war, sometimes you have to pretend you've already lost the battle. With my meeting set for Friday, I had to survive until then, and the best way to do that was to disappear in plain sight. I executed a strategic retreat. The slight cough I'd developed became a deep, rattling chest cold that kept me confined to my bed. I became the picture of a frail, declining woman. I asked for bland soups and lukewarm tea. I let Steph read to me from the most vapid, mind-numbing gossip magazines, nodding off occasionally for effect. I'd pick up the television remote and stare at it with a look of profound confusion until Rob, with an exasperated sigh, would come and change the channel for me. I even had him explain the plot of a simple detective show to me 3 separate times, and I saw the change in their eyes. The frantic panic from my question about Mark had subsided, replaced by a smug, arrogant confidence. They truly believed it had been a moment of random lucidity, a final flicker of the sharp mind they were so desperate to extinguish. They thought their clever, powerful mother was finally fading just as they'd planned. Of course, the woman they saw during the day was a phantom. At night, while the house was silent and they were sleeping, the restless sleep of the guilty, I was wide awake. I wasn't a sick old woman. I was a general planning a war. Under the covers, my iPad screen was dimmed to its lowest possible setting, a tiny square of light in the darkness. I reviewed digital copies of every financial statement I possessed, tracing the intricate architecture of the fortune I had spent a lifetime building. I read articles on elder law financial fraud and the legal requirements for declaring someone incompetent. And then I found it. I found the website for a company called Apex Wealth Partners, the firm that had apparently scammed my son and his wife. It was slick, professional, and utterly fake. It was populated with stock photos of smiling, ethnically diverse partners standing in front of a rented boardroom. It was a trap built for the greedy and the gullible, and Steph had walked right into it with her eyes wide open. The full, ugly picture didn't come to me in some dramatic flashback. It was a moment of cold, hard, deductive reasoning in the dead of night. I remembered a conversation from about a year ago. Rob, his chest puffed out, boasting about a sure thing he'd gotten into a private fund that was outperforming the market by an impossible 200%. He had been so eager, so desperate for me to invest, to validate his supposed genius. I had refused telling him plainly, as I had told countless clients over the years, that if it sounds too good to be true, it is. I remembered the bitter disappointment on his face, a look that I now understood was laced with the shame of my refusal. They hadn't just lost their money. They had lost it through sheer, unadulterated hubris. They wanted to get rich without working for it, and now they were paying the price. Their arrogance, born from the belief that I was fading away, became their undoing. One afternoon, believing I was fast asleep, Steph grew careless. She left her laptop open on the dining room table while she went upstairs to take a shower. It was the opening I needed. I moved silently, my feigned illness forgotten. I had less than 10 minutes. My fingers flew across the trackpad, navigating to the banking portal I knew she'd have bookmarked. The password was a joke, the dog's name and their anniversary. Amateurs. The screen that loaded burned with the color of failure, bright, glaring red. There was a $250,000 high-interest bridge loan with their beautiful home listed as collateral. Another for $150,000 against Rob's luxury car. And there at the bottom was the monster that was about to devour them, a final, terrifying balloon payment of $500,000 due in 2 weeks. It was a house of cards, and the slightest breeze would bring it all down. They hadn't just made a terrible mistake. They had committed financial suicide, and they were trying to drag me down right along with them. Getting to the Westchester Country Club on Friday required a performance worthy of an Oscar. I claimed I had a long-standing doctor's appointment I simply couldn't miss. Steph, of course, insisted on driving me. It was the perfect trap. She thought she was maintaining control, being the dutiful daughter-in-law, but in reality, she was chauffeuring herself to her own execution. Friday lunch on the stone terrace of the club is a sacred ritual in our world. It's where deals are closed, alliances are forged, and reputations are quietly, ruthlessly made or broken, all over chilled glasses of Sancerre. I sat at my regular table, the one overlooking the 18th green, a perfect picture of calm, moneyed elegance. I felt the eyes of my peers on me, and I gave them a serene, knowing smile. They had no idea the earthquake I was about to trigger. Right on time, Dan Harper arrived. He's a tall, stoic man in his late 60s, with a face that has absorbed the sordid secrets of the wealthy for decades without ever betraying a single one. He took his seat, telling me that Eleanor had said my call was urgent. My voice was low and steady when I replied, a chilling contrast to the warm sunshine. I told him quite simply that my son and daughter-in-law had tricked me into signing a power of attorney under false pretenses, that they were in catastrophic financial trouble and intended to loot my estate to save themselves. Before Dan could even process that, they appeared at the edge of the terrace. Steph had a tight proprietary arm linked through mine as we walked from the car. But when she saw Dan's familiar silver Mercedes in the parking lot, her grip had tightened like a vice. Now, seeing him sitting at my table, her face became a mask of pure fury and raw fear. She tried to play the part of the concerned caregiver, her voice like ice as she asked what this was, reminding me I was supposed to be resting. I looked up at her, my expression cool and unbothered, and told her I was having lunch with my lawyer. Then I gestured to the empty chairs. I told them both to sit down. Just as they hesitated a second, man approached our table. He was the physical opposite of everyone on that terrace, broad-shouldered, in an ill-fitting suit, with the weary eyes of a man who makes his living from other people's misery. He looked at my son and asked if he was Rob Ross. Rob just nodded weakly. The man slid a thick, menacing envelope onto the pristine white tablecloth. He announced in a voice devoid of any emotion that Rob had been served with foreclosure proceedings on his primary residence. The color drained from Steph's face. She stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. In that single moment, all the poise, all the carefully constructed artifice, everything she had built her identity on, simply shattered. I heard her whisper a raw animal sound of pure agony. Her wild eyes shot to me, and in them I saw the dawning, sickening horror as she finally understood that none of this was a coincidence. I let her terror hang in the air for a moment before I spoke, my voice cutting cleanly through the genteel chatter of the terrace. I informed Dan that they had lost everything. They were victims of a Ponzi scheme they were too proud to ever admit they'd fallen for. They had taken out loans they couldn't possibly repay, and then I said they decided I would be their salvation. It was too much for her, the public shaming, the legal papers, the cold, unblinking judgment in my eyes. Steph broke. A ragged sob tore from her throat, and the words tumbled out in a torrent of shame and desperation. She cried that they had lost it, all the savings, the kids' college funds, everything. She wailed that they were going to lose the house, that they were going to be nothing, and that she didn't know what else to do. Her confession was a dirty bomb detonating in the pristine, polite atmosphere of the country club. The surrounding tables fell silent. Faces turned eyes wide with that delicious mixture of shock and morbid satisfaction. The conspiracy was fractured, the ugly truth exposed to the very people whose opinions Steph valued more than life itself. My son just sat there hunched in his chair, weeping silently into his hands. I looked at the wreckage of my family not with triumph, but with a cold, clear sense of purpose. I picked up my menu. I told Dan Harper that now that we had that out of the way, I believed I would have the lobster salad. And I added, we had a great deal to discuss. The power had shifted. I was no longer the victim. I was in control. The final confrontation wasn't a shouting match in a living room filled with tears and recriminations. That had already happened in its own messy way on the terrace of the country club. No, this was something else entirely. This was a sterile, bloodless execution. It took place the following week in Dan Harper's conference room, a space paneled in dark mahogany that seemed to absorb all sound, a room that smelled of old money and binding arbitration. I had insisted on the audience. To my right sat Eleanor Vance, her posture radiating a silent, formidable strength. To my left was Mr. Abernathy, the grim-faced president of the bank that held the mortgage on my son's house, a man whose presence alone was a death sentence. Opposite us, Steph and Rob sat at the vast polished table, looking small and utterly broken. Their faces were pale and puffy from a week of sleepless nights stripped of all their former arrogance. They looked like what they were, defendants awaiting their sentence. I began, and my voice was calm and measured. I laid out the entire affair with the cold, methodical precision of a prosecutor delivering her opening statement. I started with the campaign of isolation, detailing the intercepted mail, the canceled social events, the lies told to my friends. I slid a sworn affidavit across the table, signed by all three of my bridge partners, confirming they had been told I was too unwell to see them. Then I moved to the fraudulent power of attorney. I looked directly at my son Rob and described the document he had told me was a simple estate update. I called it a lie presented with a smile. He flinched as if I'd struck him. Next, I produced the detailed financial analysis Dan's forensic accountant had prepared overnight. It was a multi-page document that showed the full, staggering depth of their debt, the predatory interest rates on their loans, the house of cards they had built. Most damningly, it included a timeline that corresponded perfectly with the sudden suffocating onset of their concern for my well-being. The moment their financial situation became critical was the exact moment they decided I was losing my mind. Finally, I slid the glossy, cheerful brochure for Apex Wealth Partners into the center of the table. I told them that this was the root of it all. This was the get-rich-quick fantasy for which they had sacrificed not only their own integrity, but my love and trust as well. The judgment, when it came, was not from me. It came from the quiet, devastating pronouncements of the powerful men sitting beside me. Dan Harper spoke first, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He stated for the record that the power of attorney they had obtained had been legally and irrevocably nullified as a product of fraud. Then Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound in the silent room. He fixed his gaze on Rob and explained that given the circumstances and the clear attempt to fraudulently leverage other family assets to secure their loans, the bank was calling in all outstanding debts, effective immediately. He added that they would be initiating proceedings to seize all collateral. But you see, the true punishment wasn't the financial ruin. It was the silent, damning judgment in that room. It was the stony look of disappointment on Eleanor's face, a woman who had once been a mentor to Steph, a woman whose respect Steph had craved. It was the cold, professional finality in Mr. Abernathy's eyes, a look that told them they were no longer valued clients, but simply liabilities to be managed. This was the social death Steph had always feared, and it was delivered not with a loud bang, but with the quiet, merciless closing of a ledger. Only then did I deliver the final terms. My voice contained no cruelty, only the unyielding finality of a judge's gavel. I told them they would sell the house, they would sell the cars, they would liquidate whatever was left and satisfy their creditors. And I made it clear I would not be giving them a single dime. I paused, letting the weight of that sentence settle in the room. I then informed them that they would be moving into the old carriage house apartment on my property. They would both find jobs, and they would, for the very first time in their pampered lives, learn to live within their means. I leaned forward slightly, meeting their shocked and broken gazes. I told them that these were not suggestions. These were the new realities of their life. Justice, proportionate and absolute, had been served. After a storm like that, the world isn't loud. It's eerily quiet. The aftermath of my family's implosion was a quiet, grinding humiliation that settled over them like a thick layer of ash. The bright red "For Sale" sign hammered into the lush lawn of their Scarsdale mansion was a beacon of gossip for the entire community. As I knew it would, the story of their financial collapse, neatly bundled with the ugly truth of their plot against me, spread through Westchester's social circles like wildfire. They were pariahs overnight. The invitations to galas and fundraisers simply stopped coming. Calls to former friends went straight to voicemail, never to be returned. I heard from Eleanor that Steph had been seen in the grocery store, and two women she'd known for a decade suddenly became intensely fascinated by a display of artisanal jams, turning their backs so completely they nearly fell into the preserves. Under the immense strain of their new reality, their paths diverged. My son Rob, stripped of the unearned status he had worn like a second skin, seemed to shrink. He got a job as a sales manager at a mid-range car dealership in Yonkers, and the humiliation of his new station was etched into every line on his face. When I saw him, he was quiet, compliant, almost ghost-like. It felt as if he were doing a slow, painful penance one day at a time. He only ever spoke to me when I spoke to him first, and his profound shame was a palpable barrier between us, a wall he had built with his own betrayal. Steph, however, remained bitter. She found work as a receptionist at a dental office, a position where she had to be professionally pleasant all day long. But I could imagine the resentment simmering just behind her forced, polite smile. In her mind, she was the true victim. A victim of a bad investment. A victim of circumstance, and most of all, a victim of a cruel mother-in-law who possessed the power to save them, but chose to punish them instead. She kept the small carriage house apartment immaculate, a perfect miniature version of her old life. But her presence on my property was a constant pocket of cold fury. There was no accountability, no remorse. There was only a curdled, impotent rage. And me, I thrived. I re-engaged with my life with a vigor I hadn't felt in years. It was as if a great weight had been lifted, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I rejoined my weekly bridge club. Eleanor and I took a trip to Italy that we'd been putting off for years. And with Dan's help, I used a portion of my money to establish a charitable foundation dedicated to providing financial literacy education for seniors, a quiet, fitting tribute to my own ordeal. My home, once a target for my family's greed, was now a hub of warmth and genuine activity, filled with friends who valued my wisdom and my wit, not my wallet. One crisp autumn afternoon, a few months later, I was in my garden pruning my rose bushes. I saw Rob walking up the long gravel driveway from the carriage house. His shoulders were slumped, the posture of a man exhausted by more than just a long day at work. He stopped a few feet away from me, careful to keep a respectful distance. He told me, his voice quiet, that the house had sold. They would be able to clear everything. He looked at me then, and his eyes were filled with a grief that went so much deeper than just the loss of money or status. He said he was sorry. Sorry for everything. It wasn't a solution, and it wasn't an absolution. But it was a start. I nodded slowly, a single, sharp acknowledgement. Then I turned back to my roses and snipped away a dead, withered branch. The wound was deep, and a scar would always remain. But I was the master of my own garden now. The air was clean, the sun was warm on my face, and I was finally completely free. In the end, Diane's victory taught a difficult lesson. She came to understand that her family's betrayal was born from a genuine, desperate fear of ruin. But she also knew that understanding the motivation for a cruel act never excuses the act itself. She learned that true strength wasn't found in vengeance, but in delivering proportionate justice with calm resolve, protecting her own world while acknowledging the sad human weakness that had threatened to destroy it.